My name is Gavin Walker. I'm 38 years old. I live just outside Portland, Oregon. I work as a structural engineer, the kind of job where precision matters, where mistakes don't announce themselves dramatically, but reveal themselves years later in quiet cracks. Most people would describe me as steady, dependable, soft-spoken, the man who shows up early and leaves last, the man who fixes the hinge, pays the mortgage, packs the school lunches, remembers the dentist appointments. If you met me at a neighborhood barbecue, you'd probably forget my name before dessert. I don't command a room. I don't interrupt. I don't compete for attention. For most of my adult life, I believed that was a strength. For 10 years, I devoted myself to being a husband and a father. Not loudly, not performatively, just consistently. I believed love was measured in repetition, in bedtime stories read even when you're exhausted, in scraped knees cleaned gently, in showing up to every school recital even if your child's only line is tree number 3. My son, Caleb, was the center of that devotion. I loved him before I ever saw his face. I loved him in the quiet hours of rocking him to sleep. I loved him through fevers, through nightmares, through the long stretch of years where fatherhood is less about grand moments and more about showing up every single day. And then one afternoon, something shifted. Not dramatically, not with shouting, not with a confession bursting through the front door. It began with a resemblance, a small, almost laughable resemblance, the kind you dismiss the first time you notice it, the kind you tell yourself is a coincidence. After a decade of unconditional love, I began to see something I could no longer ignore. The curve of a cheekbone, the set of a smile, the shape of eyes that did not quite echo mine. They echoed someone else's, the neighbor my wife claimed to despise. This isn't a story about revenge. It's not about exposing anyone publicly. And it's not about dramatic confrontations under pouring rain. This is a story about realization, about silence, about what happens when the man everyone underestimates decides to stop ignoring what he sees. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened. Not to punish anyone, not to paint myself as a victim, but because sometimes the quietest shifts are the ones that change everything. Have you ever had a moment where something small unsettled you, and you couldn't unsee it? If you asked my wife, Emily, who I was back then, she would have said I was solid. She liked that word. Solid meant predictable. It meant I didn't make scenes. It meant I didn't forget birthdays or slam doors or drink too much at office parties. Solid meant safe. And safe in our world was a compliment. To my colleagues, I was the engineer who double-checked everyone else's math. The quiet one in meetings who spoke last, and only if necessary. I wasn't charismatic. I wasn't visionary. But when something needed to hold weight, they handed it to me. To our neighbors, I was the guy mowing his lawn at the same time every Saturday morning. The one who volunteered to fix the leaning fence between properties without asking for half the cost. The man who waved first. And to Caleb, my son, I was just dad. The one who knew how to untangle fishing line. The one who could build a treehouse platform that didn't wobble. The one who always stayed until he fell asleep. But here's the thing about being solid. People stop looking closely at you. They assume your reactions. They assume your limits. They assume your loyalty is permanent. Emily used to tease me about how little it bothered me. "You're impossible to provoke," she'd say, half amused, half exasperated. "Sometimes I wonder if you even notice things." I noticed everything. I just didn't broadcast it. That was my role, the quiet absorber of tension. If a disagreement surfaced at dinner with friends, I redirected the topic. If Emily had a stressful day at work, I listened. If Caleb threw a tantrum, I knelt down instead of raising my voice. I believed strength meant containment, and over time, containment becomes identity. I was the husband who didn't question, the father who didn't doubt, the neighbor who didn't pry. And then there was Daniel Harper. He lived 2 houses down, early 40s, real estate broker, the kind of man who fills space without trying. Loud laugh, 2 white teeth, always leaning slightly forward when he talked, as if the world were perpetually about to miss something important he had to say. Emily couldn't stand him. At least, that's what she told me. She rolled her eyes when he revved his sports car, mocked his expensive watch, called him performative. She said men like him were insecure underneath. I believed her. Why wouldn't I? Daniel would clap me on the back at neighborhood gatherings and call me professor, even though I'd corrected him more than once that I wasn't one. He'd joke about how I must be calculating the structural integrity of the grill. I'd smile, because smiling was easier than correcting someone who wasn't really asking. To him, I was harmless. To the neighborhood, I was background noise. To Emily, I was stability. And to myself, I was certain of 2 things. 1, I loved my family. Completely. 2. Love, when steady enough, solved most problems before they formed. If something felt slightly off in our marriage during those years, I told myself it was routine. If Emily seemed distracted sometimes, I assumed it was work stress. If Daniel lingered in conversation a little too long, I dismissed it as ego. After all, I wasn't the jealous type. I wasn't insecure. I was solid. But what no one understood about being underestimated is this. When you don't react loudly, people assume you don't see clearly. And the truth is, I saw more than they ever realized. I just hadn't decided yet what it meant. The first time it happened, it was almost funny. We were at a 4th of July cookout in Daniel's backyard. He'd gone all out. String lights woven through the trees, a rented smoker the size of a small boat, craft beer lined up like trophies. Emily had insisted we go, even though she'd spent the afternoon beforehand criticizing his need for spectacle. Caleb was 8 at the time, skinny knees, constant motion. He had this way of smiling with his whole face, like the expression started somewhere deep behind his eyes and spilled outward. Daniel crouched down to Caleb's level while the kids were chasing each other with sparklers. "Kid's got a strong jaw," he said casually, glancing up at me. "Doesn't he?" I laughed. "Guess he didn't get that from me." Daniel grinned, too wide. "Yeah," he said. "Funny how that works sometimes." It was subtle, the kind of comment you could drive past without slowing down. No accusation, no emphasis, just tone. Emily was standing beside me. I remember turning slightly, expecting her to roll her eyes at him the way she always did. She didn't. She was watching Caleb, too intently. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then she smiled and said something about needing more lemonade. That was it. The conversation moved on. Fireworks later painted the sky red and gold. We walked home under the smoky haze of celebration. But that night, lying in bed, I replayed it. Strong jaw. It wasn't the words. It was the look Daniel gave me afterward. Brief, unreadable, almost measuring. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Men compare children all the time. They project. They joke. They look for similarities because it's an easy social bridge. Still, the thought lingered. A few weeks later, it happened again. We were out front. I was fixing the loose hinge on our mailbox when Daniel walked by on his morning jog. Caleb was sitting on the porch steps, flipping through a comic book. Daniel slowed down. "Morning, champ," he said to Caleb. "You ever think about getting into sports? You've got the build for it." Caleb shrugged. "Dad says I'm more of a thinker." Daniel laughed. "Nothing wrong with that. But sometimes you've got to surprise people." He looked at me when he said it. Not aggressive, not mocking, just deliberate. Again, small, insignificant. Except that later that afternoon, when Caleb was at a friend's house, I found myself studying an old photo album. Not intentionally. I'd gone into the closet to grab a winter jacket, and the album slid off the shelf. There was a picture of me at 8, rounder face, softer chin, different smile. Children change as they grow. Genetics skips around, traits blend unpredictably. I knew that. I'm an engineer. I believe in data, in probability. But something about Daniel's tone, that faint undercurrent, felt like the beginning of a sentence he wasn't finishing. I didn't confront anyone, didn't ask Emily anything, didn't even allow the suspicion to fully form. Instead, I did what I'd always done. I absorbed it. Because when you've built your identity around being unshakable, admitting that something has unsettled you feels like structural failure. And I wasn't ready to believe the foundation had a crack. Not yet. Once you dismiss something, it becomes easier to dismiss it again. That's the part no one talks about. The mind prefers stability over truth. It would rather smooth over a crack than admit the wall might not be load-bearing. After that summer, Daniel's comments didn't stop. They just evolved. They were always wrapped in humor, always delivered lightly, always positioned so that if I reacted, I'd look unreasonable. At a neighborhood block party, someone mentioned how quickly Caleb was growing. Daniel smiled and said, "Yeah, some kids just take after the right influences." A pause. Then he took a sip of his drink. The others laughed, assuming it was nothing. I laughed too, half a second late. Emily nudged my arm playfully. "Ignore him," she whispered. "He loves hearing himself talk." That should have been enough. It wasn't, because I started noticing something else. Caleb had begun spending more time outside when Daniel was around. Not deliberately, just magnetically. Daniel was good with kids. Confident. Physical. The kind of man who could toss a football effortlessly across the yard and make it look like gravity worked differently for him. I told myself that was healthy. Boys need role models, energy, variety. But once you've seen a resemblance, your brain starts cataloguing evidence. The slope of Caleb's nose in profile. The way his eyebrows lifted slightly higher on one side when he was amused. The shape of his hands. I hated myself for noticing. So I rationalized. Genetics is complicated. Children don't come out as carbon copies. Resemblance is subjective. And besides, Emily despised Daniel. She complained about him often enough. Said he flirted with everyone. Said he lacked depth. Said he was exactly the kind of man she'd never be attracted to. The repetition of that statement should have reassured me. Instead, it began to feel rehearsed. Still, I said nothing, because confrontation requires certainty. And I didn't have certainty, only discomfort. There was one evening in particular that I can't forget. We were all standing near the fence between our yards. Daniel had just finished installing new patio lights. Caleb was watching, fascinated. "You've got steady hands," Daniel told him. "That's important. Precision." I felt something tighten in my chest. That was my word. Precision. It was small, petty, even. But it felt like an intrusion, as if he were borrowing pieces of me, or maybe staking a claim. Emily laughed at something Daniel said. Not a polite laugh, a real one. Head tilted back slightly, unfiltered. I realized I hadn't heard that version of her laughter directed at me in a while. That night, after Caleb went to bed, I mentioned, gently, that Daniel seemed overly familiar lately. Emily sighed. "Gavin, please, don't start imagining things. He's just social. You know you tend to overthink." Overthink. It wasn't cruel, it wasn't shouted, but it landed, because suddenly my quiet observation, the very thing that defined me, was reframed as a flaw. So I did what I'd always done when confronted with subtle dismissal. I stepped back. I told myself I was being insecure. That fatigue was amplifying patterns that weren't there. That marriage requires trust, not surveillance. Disrespect rarely announces itself with a slap. It erodes. It suggests you're mistaken. It reframes your perception as paranoia. It invites you to doubt your own instincts. And I let it, because being the steady one meant not destabilizing the room, even if the room was slowly shifting beneath my feet. There's a moment in every long relationship when you realize you've stopped being seen as a person and started being seen as a function. It doesn't happen all at once. It accumulates. By year 9 of our marriage, I wasn't Gavin in our household. I was the system administrator. I handled the mortgage auto-pay. I reviewed the insurance renewals. I scheduled the HVAC maintenance. I packed Caleb's lunches when Emily had early meetings. I stayed up late reconciling the credit card statements because you're better with numbers. No one forced this on me. I stepped into it willingly, because being useful felt safe. If you are indispensable, you cannot be discarded. At least that's what I told myself. Emily had grown more ambitious in her career over the years. Marketing director now, bigger clients, later hours, more travel. I supported it, genuinely. I believed in her talent. But slowly, the balance shifted. When she vented about her boss, I listened. When she needed quiet to prepare a presentation, I took Caleb out for ice cream. When she forgot an anniversary dinner reservation, I pretended I had too. It wasn't martyrdom. It was efficiency, and efficiency is seductive. It disguises imbalance as practicality. Daniel, meanwhile, remained exactly what he'd always been. Loud, confident, visible. The contrast between us became sharper the longer I ignored it. At neighborhood gatherings, he told stories. I refilled drinks. He led group conversations. I cleared plates. He teased. I absorbed. And no one questioned it, because the roles made sense. Daniel was charismatic. I was infrastructure. The night I truly understood my role came unexpectedly. We were hosting a small dinner. 4 couples, wine, laughter, controlled chaos. At some point, someone asked how Emily and I managed such a balanced partnership. Before I could answer, she smiled and said, "Oh, Gavin just handles everything. I'd be lost without him." Everyone nodded approvingly, but something in the phrasing stuck. Handles everything, not we support each other, not he's my partner, not we're a team. I handled, like an appliance, reliable, quiet, replaceable if broken. Later that evening, as guests were leaving, Daniel lingered at the door. He looked around at the clean kitchen, the neatly stacked dishes, and the sleeping house. "You make it look easy," he said to me. I met his eyes. "It's not," I replied calmly. For a split second, something flickered across his face. Not mockery, not amusement. Recognition, as if he understood more about the structure than anyone else did. That was when it became clear to me. I had been assigned a role, the dependable husband, the rational father, the man who wouldn't explode, the man who wouldn't leave, the man who wouldn't question too loudly. And when people assign you that role long enough, they stop considering the possibility that you might revise it. I didn't confront Emily that night. I didn't challenge Daniel. I simply sat alone at the kitchen table after everyone left, looking at the quiet house I had helped build. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. If I stopped handling everything, what would remain? It wasn't a fight. There was no argument, no slammed doors, no confession. It was a Tuesday. Rain had started early that morning. The steady Oregon kind that doesn't fall dramatically, just persists. I was working from home, reviewing load calculations for a pedestrian bridge redesign. Numbers, angles, stress tolerances. Caleb had stayed home from school with a mild fever. Nothing serious. He was curled up on the couch with a blanket, watching a nature documentary. Around noon, he fell asleep. I closed my laptop and walked into the living room to check on him. The house was quiet. Refrigerator hum, rain against the windows, the soft rhythm of his breathing. I sat on the armchair across from him, and I looked. Not casually, not distractedly. I studied his face the way I would study a blueprint. The line of his brow, the spacing of his eyes, the arc of his cheekbones. Children change constantly. Features sharpen. Baby softness recedes. But that day, something aligned too clearly. The angle of his jaw, not mine. The narrow bridge of his nose, not Emily's. The slight asymmetry in his smile. I had seen that before. On Daniel, the thought arrived fully formed this time. Not a whisper, not a suggestion. A statement. I felt no surge of anger, no rush of heat. Just stillness. The kind of stillness that comes before a structural realization. When you recognize that what you assumed was decorative may actually be load-bearing. I walked to the hallway closet and pulled down the old photo album again. I laid it on the dining table. I found pictures of myself at 10. Then I opened my phone and scrolled through recent photos of Caleb, side by side. It wasn't proof, but it wasn't imagination either. My chest didn't tighten. It hollowed. Because the fear wasn't betrayal. The fear was something quieter. What if the last 10 years had been built on an assumption so foundational that questioning it would collapse everything? At 2:14 p.m., my phone buzzed. A message from Emily. Running late tonight. Daniel offered to help fix the loose gutter while it's still raining. Thought that might help. I read it twice, Daniel offered. While I was home, while Caleb was sick, while the rain fell steadily against the windows. I looked back at my son, then at the front yard. Through the rain-streaked glass, I could see Daniel's truck pull up. He stepped out without hesitation, grabbed a ladder from his bed, and walked toward our house like he'd done it 100 times. Maybe he had. I didn't go outside. I didn't greet him. I didn't stop him. Instead, I remained seated at the dining table, the photo album open in front of me, the rain forming quiet distortions on the window between us. And something inside me shifted. Not toward confrontation, not toward accusation, toward clarity. If there was nothing to hide, evidence would confirm it. If there was something to hide, silence would not protect me. For 10 years, I had assumed stability was maintained through trust alone. That afternoon, I realized stability requires verification. Not paranoia, not rage, verification. I closed the album carefully, walked to my desk, and took out my leather notebook. Not to write an accusation, just a date, a time, an observation. Because when a structure feels compromised, you don't demolish it immediately. You assess, quietly, thoroughly. And for the first time in my marriage, my silence wasn't avoidance. It was a decision. There's a difference between silence born from fear and silence chosen with intention. For years, I had stayed quiet because I believed harmony required it. Because I didn't want to be the suspicious husband. Because I didn't want to destabilize what we'd built. After that Tuesday, my silence changed texture. It wasn't soft anymore. It was deliberate. Daniel finished fixing the gutter that afternoon. I heard the metallic scrape of the ladder, the thud of boots against siding. At one point, he knocked lightly on the door to let me know he was done. I opened it. Rain dotted his shoulders. He smiled. All set, he said. Didn't want it causing damage. Appreciate it, I replied evenly. We held eye contact half a second longer than usual. He seemed relaxed. Too relaxed. As if he understood that I wouldn't make things uncomfortable. And he was right. I didn't. That evening, Emily thanked me for letting Daniel help. Letting. Interesting word. I was working, I said simply. She studied my face briefly, as if expecting irritation. There wasn't any, because something had crystallized in me. If there was nothing there, patience would reveal it. If there was something there, the reaction would only alert it. So I began observing with precision, not obsessively, not erratically, methodically. I paid attention to timelines. When Emily said she'd be home late, I noted when she actually arrived. When Daniel's truck was parked down the street, I registered the duration. When Caleb mentioned things he'd learned or done, I listened carefully to the phrasing. I wasn't hunting, I was gathering data, and what struck me most wasn't overt behavior. It was subtle familiarity. Emily and Daniel shared references I hadn't heard before. Inside jokes that formed mid-conversation. A shorthand. Small, almost invisible things. The kind you only notice when you stop assuming innocence. What surprised me most was how calm I felt. No pacing at night, no interrogations, no checking phones, just watchfulness. Emily mistook it for detachment. "You've been distant lately," she said one evening while we were folding laundry. "Just tired," I answered. She nodded, satisfied. Daniel mistook it for passivity. At a weekend barbecue, he made another light comment about Caleb's athletic genes. I met his eyes, held them calmly, and said nothing. He looked away first. That was new. Silence unsettles people when they expect a reaction. When you don't defend yourself, they assume you haven't noticed. When you don't accuse, they assume you lack evidence. They mistake restraint for incapacity. And I because reacting emotionally would confirm the version of me they'd already assigned. The stable but naive husband. Instead, I shifted internally. I reviewed old memories differently. That work conference Emily attended the year Caleb turned 2. The sudden improvement in Daniel's friendliness occurred around the same time. The exaggerated way Emily expressed dislike toward him. Overcompensation is rarely random. Still, I didn't jump to conclusions, because assumptions are fragile, evidence is not. And so my silence became a strategy. I stopped filling conversational gaps, stopped volunteering for extra reassurance, stopped explaining my thoughts prematurely. I conserved energy, not for revenge, for clarity. If the foundation of my family were intact, the investigation would strengthen it. If it wasn't, then I needed to know before I continued carrying weight that wasn't mine. For the first time in my life, being underestimated felt like an advantage. They thought I wasn't reacting. What they didn't understand was this. I was preparing. Preparation rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. It looks like normalcy. It looks like a man continuing to mow his lawn every Saturday morning. That's why no one noticed. I didn't install hidden cameras. I didn't follow anyone in my car. I didn't demand passwords. I did something much quieter. I began organizing information. As an engineer, I'm trained to identify patterns under stress, to detect where load exceeds capacity. Marriages aren't bridges, but they are systems. Systems reveal strain through repetition. So I built a private framework. Dates, times, conversations, behavioral shifts, not accusations, observations. I noted when Emily's tone changed at the mention of Daniel, the microsecond pause before casual dismissal. I tracked how often Daniel appeared coincidentally when I was working late or out running errands. I wrote down Caleb's comments verbatim when he referenced things I hadn't been present for. Daniel says, "Daniel showed me. Daniel thinks, it wasn't jealousy. It was anomaly detection." And then there were the photographs, family pictures, holiday shots, candid backyard moments. I enlarged them privately on my laptop, studying angles of bone structure the way I would study architectural symmetry. It's uncomfortable to admit this. But the resemblance was not fading with age. It was sharpening. I told myself resemblance does not equal proof, but probability has weight. One evening, while reviewing old financial statements, something I routinely handled anyway, I noticed small but consistent ATM withdrawals on days Emily had said she was at work dinners. Not large sums, just enough to register as intentional. Could be harmless, could be convenient. So I cross-referenced. Daniel had refinanced his house 3 years earlier. Public record. His wife had left shortly after. That timeline overlapped with a period when Emily had been emotionally distant, as she once described it. Again. Circumstantial. But patterns don't need drama, they need consistency. What they never noticed was that I had stopped filling in gaps emotionally. When Emily said she'd be late, I no longer responded with reassurance. I simply said, "Okay." When Daniel invited us over, I didn't decline. I observed. Silence makes people talk more. Daniel began oversharing about his divorce, about loneliness, about mistakes you can't undo. Once, during a quiet moment on his patio, he said something strange. "You ever think about how different life would be if one small choice had gone another way?" I held his gaze. "I try not to live in hypotheticals," I replied. He smiled faintly, but there was tension in it. I began reading about paternity testing laws in Oregon, not because I wanted a scandal, because I wanted the procedure. If Caleb were biologically mine, I would bury these suspicions permanently and repair whatever insecurity had taken root in me. If he wasn't, then my decisions needed to be deliberate, not reactive. I researched quietly, learned about at-home tests, chain of custody documentation, legal admissibility. No one saw that part. To Emily, I was still tired but steady. To Daniel, I was still predictable Gavin. To Caleb, I was still Dad. And here's the hardest part. My love for Caleb never shifted. Not once. Suspicion about biology did not dilute attachment. If anything, it intensified my need for truth, because fatherhood is not just genetic, but deception is structural, and I could not continue building a life on unverified foundations. One night, After everyone was asleep, I stood in the hallway outside Caleb's room. I listened to his breathing. 10 years of bedtime stories, 10 years of scraped knees, 10 years of whispered, "I love you, Dad." Whatever the outcome, I would protect him from unnecessary harm. That was non-negotiable. But protecting him did not mean protecting a lie. Preparation doesn't require anger. It requires discipline. And by the end of that month, I had moved from suspicion to readiness. All that remained was confirmation. I didn't choose a dramatic moment. No storm, no anniversary dinner, no argument. I chose a Saturday morning. Caleb and I had a routine: pancakes, then a trip to the hardware store or the park. That morning, I told him we'd add something small to the day. A science project. He liked those. We'd done harmless experiments before, testing water pH, building small circuits, comparing soil samples from different parts of the yard. Curiosity was something we shared. I ordered the paternity test weeks earlier under the pretense of a general DNA ancestry kit. The packaging was discreet, clinical, neutral. When it arrived, I didn't open it immediately. I let it sit in my desk drawer for 3 days. Not because I was afraid of the result, because I understood the weight of crossing that threshold. Once data exists, you can't unknow it. That Saturday, after pancakes, I brought the box to the dining table. "Swab test," I told Caleb lightly. "Just a cheek sample. We'll see what kind of genes you've got for building things." He grinned. "Like you." Something like that. He didn't question it. Why would he? I had always been the one who explained the world calmly, methodically. We followed the instructions carefully. I labelled the envelopes with steady hands. Mine didn't shake. When we dropped the package at the post office, I felt no surge of panic, only inevitability. The waiting period was 2 weeks, 14 days of normal dinners, normal work schedules, normal conversations. Emily didn't suspect anything. Daniel continued his routines. I continued mine. But internally, something had already shifted. I had stepped outside the assumption. I was standing in the space between belief and evidence. The email arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. Subject line, "Results available." I was alone in my home office. For a full minute, I stared at the screen without clicking, not because I hoped it would say one thing or another, but because I understood that whatever the result was, it would not just answer a question. It would redefine 10 years. I opened it. There's no cinematic sound when something fundamental changes. No music, no echo, just text. Probability of paternity, 0%. 0. Not low, not inconclusive. 0. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. And here's what surprised me. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel an urge to storm into Daniel's house. I felt clarity. The resemblance was not a projection. The comments were not harmless. The tension was not imagined. But beneath all of that, there was something else. Grief. Not for the loss of biology, for the loss of narrative. For 10 years, I had believed I was raising my biological son with the woman who chose me. That story had structured my identity. Now the structure had changed, but Caleb was still asleep in his room at night. He still ran to me when he scraped his knee. He still whispered, "Dad, can you check under the bed?" Biology had shifted. Fatherhood had not. I printed the results, folded the paper once, placed it inside my leather notebook. No dramatic confrontation, no immediate text message, because data alone does not dictate action. It informs it, and action, if chosen emotionally, would fracture more than it fixed. I stood up, walked to the kitchen, started dinner. When Emily came home that evening, she kissed my cheek. "Long day?" she asked. "Productive," I replied. She smiled. Unaware. Daniel's truck was parked 2 houses down. For the first time since this began, I wasn't observing to confirm suspicion. I was observing to determine the consequence. I had the truth. Now I had to decide what kind of man I would be in response to it. Truth doesn't tell you what to do. It just removes the illusion that you don't have to choose. For 3 days after I received the results, I said nothing. Not because I was in shock. Not because I was formulating accusations. Because I was mapping outcomes. There were several paths available to me. Path 1. Confrontation. Immediate, explosive, undeniable. Printout on the kitchen table. Demands, explanations, tears, confessions. Path 2. Legal action first. Quietly retain counsel. File for divorce. Serve papers without warning. Let the law speak before I do. Path 3. Denial. Destroy the results. Pretend I had never opened the email. Continue life as it was for Caleb's sake. Path 4. Something slower, more deliberate. Protect the innocent. Secure my position. Then speak. Once, calmly. Without heat. Each option carried consequences. If I confronted immediately, emotion would take control of the narrative. Emily could deny. Daniel could deflect. The discussion would spiral into accusation versus explanation, and Caleb, the only truly blameless person in this structure, would feel the tremor first. If I ignored it, I would be complicit in my own deception. That left a strategy. I scheduled a consultation with a family law attorney under the pretense of financial planning. In Oregon, legal fatherhood after a decade of raising a child is not automatically erased by biology. I needed to understand custody implications before I said a word. The attorney, a woman in her 50s with precise diction, reviewed the situation clinically. "Are you seeking to sever parental rights?" she asked. "No," I replied immediately. That answer surprised even me. I wasn't looking to erase Caleb. I was looking to reconfigure truth without destroying him. She explained timelines, documentation, the impact of established parental bonds. She told me something that settled my spine. "In cases like this," she said, "courts often prioritize the psychological father, not biological." That phrase anchored me. Over the next week, I separated joint financial accounts quietly. Not aggressively, just prudently. I documented household contributions, mortgage payments, education savings I had funded. I wasn't preparing for war, I was preparing for stability. At home, nothing appeared different. Emily discussed an upcoming marketing conference. Daniel stopped by one evening to return a borrowed ladder. I watched him stand in my driveway and talk about property values like the world was uncomplicated. He had no idea I was already standing 3 moves ahead. The hardest decision wasn't legal. It was emotional. When do you tell a child? And what do you tell him? Caleb was 10, old enough to sense tension, too young to process betrayal. I decided something important that week. Whatever confrontation happened, it would not happen in front of him. Whatever consequences unfolded, he would never hear raised voices from me. Whatever Emily had done, Caleb would not carry her guilt. The irreversible choice wasn't divorce. It was this. I would no longer carry a lie for the sake of comfort. Silence had served the investigation. Now it would serve positioning. Once I spoke, nothing could return to what it was. So I waited until everything was aligned, legally, financially, emotionally. And when I finally decided to move, it wouldn't be reactive. It would be final. Once I decided, everything became procedural. There's a certain calm that comes when emotion no longer drives the wheel. I wasn't suppressing anger. I simply wasn't governed by it. First, I redirected my salary into a new individual account. Not secretly. Legally. Quiet transfers, clean documentation. Joint obligations were still covered, mortgage paid, utilities intact. Caleb's school tuition is untouched. Stability for him was non-negotiable. Second, I scheduled a formal meeting with the attorney and initiated a draft separation agreement. Not filed, drafted, structured. It outlined custody, division of assets, and, importantly, established my intent to remain Caleb's legal father regardless of biological findings. That clause mattered to me. It wasn't leverage against Emily, it was protection for Caleb. Third, I updated my will, quietly. I ensured Caleb remained the primary beneficiary of everything I had built. Blood did not redefine legacy. From the outside, I was unchanged. I still made dinner, still helped with homework, still asked Emily about her day. If anything, I was calmer than usual. Emily noticed. "You seem lighter," she said one evening while we were washing dishes. "I've been organizing things," I replied. That wasn't a lie. Daniel continued drifting in and out of our orbit. Sometimes literally, jogging past at convenient times, offering casual help, and inserting himself into conversations that didn't require him. One afternoon, he stood at the fence and chatted while Caleb practiced throwing a baseball. "Good arm!" he called out. "Natural!" I watched the arc of the ball. Clean. Accurate. Natural. The word carried no power anymore. I had the data. His tone no longer unsettled me. Silence, when informed by truth, becomes armor. I also gathered secondary documentation, text messages Emily had once asked me to retrieve from a shared cloud backup when she'd lost her phone years earlier. Archived data is persistent. Most people forget that. I wasn't searching for pain. I was verifying the timeline, and there it was. Messages from a decade ago. Emotional intimacy. Confessions disguised as confusion. References to secrecy. References to timing. Caleb's birth date aligned precisely with that period. There was no dramatic declaration in those texts. No, this is your child. But the implication was unmistakable. I saved copies, encrypted, not to weaponize, to anchor. During those days, I paid close attention to myself. Was I becoming colder, harder? Surprisingly, no. I was becoming more precise. Emotion without direction is chaos. Emotion with structure is clarity. Emily continued living as though equilibrium existed. She discussed future vacations, renovation ideas, school options for middle school. Plans were built on the assumption that I would always remain the steady center, and I would, just not in the way she imagined. By the end of the second week, everything was ready. The draft separation agreement, the documented evidence. The DNA results were printed and sealed. All that remained was timing. Confrontation, I realized, isn't about catching someone off guard. It's about ensuring that when truth enters the room, it cannot be bent. And I intended to speak only once. Not loudly, not cruelly, but definitely. Because once silence becomes strategic, the end of it must be deliberate. Consequences don't always arrive with noise. Sometimes they begin as an absence. I stopped initiating affection first. Not coldly, not pointedly. I simply allowed space to remain space. When Emily reached for my hand during a movie, I held it. But I didn't tighten my grip the way I used to. When she kissed my cheek goodbye, I smiled, but didn't lean in further. She noticed. You okay? You okay? She asked one morning. I'm fine, I said calmly. That answer unsettles a people more than anger ever could. At work, I requested additional project travel, something I'd declined for years to be home more. It wasn't avoidance, but it was repositioning, expanding professional flexibility before the shift became public. Emily commented on it. You used to hate traveling. Things change, I replied. Meanwhile, Daniel began feeling something he couldn't name. I saw it in the way he studied me during neighborhood gatherings. Less joking, more searching. One evening, he attempted one of his usual half-coded comments about Caleb's competitive spirit. I met his eyes and held them a fraction too long. No smile, no defense, just steady awareness. He looked away first. Again, confidence thrives when it's unchallenged. Remove the reaction, and it starts to erode. At home, I reduced unnecessary explanations. If I worked late, I didn't justify it. If I stepped out for an hour, I simply said, I'll be back shortly. Emily grew slightly anxious without understanding why. It's remarkable how quickly people feel instability when the person anchoring the system stops over-functioning. Bills were still paid, dinner is still cooked, laundry is still folded, but something invisible had shifted. Emily tried to compensate with heightened warmth. She suggested a weekend getaway. She initiated deeper conversations at night. You felt distant, she admitted one evening. Did I do something? I looked at her for a long moment. You'll know when we need to talk, I said gently. That sentence landed heavier than an accusation, because it implied inevitability. Caleb sensed something too, though he couldn't articulate it. He asked once, Dad, are you and Mum mad at each other? No, I said truthfully. We're just thinking. He accepted that. Children trust tone more than words. Daniel, on the other hand, began testing boundaries subtly. He invited me alone for a drink one Friday evening. Man to man, he said casually. We never really talk. Interesting timing, I declined politely. Another time. His smile tightened. He didn't know what had changed. But he felt it. That's the thing about quiet dominance. It doesn't announce itself. It alters gravitational pull. By the end of that week, the emotional climate had shifted. Emily was trying to reconnect without understanding the breach. Daniel was measuring a distance he couldn't explain. Caleb was watching, sensitive but secure. And I was steady, not suppressing, not seething, simply aware that the next movement would redraw the entire map. Consequences don't begin with shouting. They begin the moment one person stops pretending not to know. And I had stopped. I chose a Sunday evening. Caleb was staying overnight at a friend's house, planned weeks earlier. I had made sure of that. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been for years. No background cartoons, no homework questions drifting down the hallway. Just Emily and me. She was in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone, half watching a cooking show. I stood across from her for a moment before speaking. We need to talk tonight, I said calmly. She looked up immediately. About what? Everything. The word changed the air. We sat at the dining table, the same table where we'd celebrated birthdays, helped Caleb with school projects, and hosted dinners. I placed the leather notebook in front of me. No theatrics, no raised voice. I know, I said. 2 words. Her expression shifted. Confusion first, then calculation. Know what? She asked carefully. I slid the folded paper across the table. She didn't touch it at first. You should read it, I said. Her hands were steady when she unfolded the page. They weren't steady after. I watched her eyes move across the lines. Watched the blood drain from her face slowly. Not dramatically, but undeniably. Silence stretched. This isn't, she began. It's verified, I replied evenly. Chain of custody. Legally admissible. That ended the denial before it formed. Her breathing changed. Faster. I was going to tell you, she whispered. No, I said quietly. You weren't. There was no anger in my tone, just accuracy. Tears came. Not explosive sobbing, but fractured attempts to regain footing. "It was years ago," she said. "It was a mistake. I didn't know." "You knew there was a possibility," I interrupted gently. She didn't answer. That was enough. "What about Daniel?" I asked. Her eyes closed. That confirmed the rest. I didn't press further. I didn't need details. The timeline was already documented. The messages are archived. "What happens now?" she asked, voice breaking. I slid another document across the table, the draft separation agreement. Her eyes widened. "You've been planning this?" "I've been preparing," I corrected. Panic surfaced then. "We can fix this," she said quickly. "We can go to counseling. We can—" "Gavin, please, don't do this to Caleb." That was the first time emotion rose in me. Not anger, but protectiveness. "I'm not doing anything to Caleb," I said firmly. "I am his father. That does not change." She looked at me as if she was seeing me clearly for the first time. "You're not yelling," she said, almost in disbelief. "No, you're not even angry." "I'm not confused," I replied. That's what unsettled her most. Rage can be negotiated with. Confusion can be redirected. Clarity cannot. "You should have talked to me," she whispered. "I did," I said calmly. "You called it overthinking." The room felt smaller then, not because of tension, because illusion had evaporated. She tried one more time. "It didn't mean anything." I held her gaze. "It meant enough." There was no shouting, no insults, just the sound of something final settling into place. Too late to fix it doesn't mean too late to apologize. It means too late to restore what trust once was. And trust, once structurally compromised, does not return to its original form. It becomes something else, or it ends. I didn't confront Daniel immediately. There was no need to rush. Emily had confirmed what I already knew. The separation process had begun the next morning. Paperwork filed. Temporary arrangements outlined. Caleb is still unaware of the details, only told that Mom and Dad need to reorganize some things. The confrontation with Daniel wasn't about discovery. It was about acknowledgement. I chose a neutral setting. Late afternoon, his driveway. No audience. He was washing his car when I walked over. Sunlight reflected off the windshield in sharp flashes. Ordinary scene. Ordinary suburb. He saw me and smiled. That familiar, practiced confidence. "Hey, Professor," he said. What's up?" I stopped a few feet away, hands relaxed at my sides. "We should talk," I said evenly. Something in my tone shifted his posture. He straightened. "About? I know Caleb is your—" There it was. No accusation, no dramatic build-up. Just a fact. He didn't respond immediately. He looked at me, not defiant, not smug, measured. "I figured you might," he said quietly. Not denial, not an apology. Recognition. "How long?" I asked. He exhaled slowly. "Emily never told you?" "This isn't about what she told me." He nodded once, absorbing that. "It was a long time ago," he said. "It wasn't planned." "I'm aware." He wiped his hands with a towel, a stall tactic more than necessity. "I never meant for it to—" "To what?" I asked calmly. "Continue existing." That landed. He didn't meet my eyes for a moment. "I stayed out of it," he said defensively. "You raised him. I didn't interfere." I considered that. "You made comments," I said. "You stayed close." A flicker of discomfort crossed his face. "I didn't think you knew," he admitted. "That was the assumption," I replied. Silence. Birds, somewhere in the distance. A lawnmower humming down the street. "You going to tell him?" Daniel asked. The question carried weight, not authority. "I will decide what Caleb needs to know," I said evenly. "Not you." He nodded again. There was no bravado left. "You want me to move?" he asked quietly. That surprised me. I studied him carefully. "For your sake," I said to your sake, I say, distance would be wise. It wasn't a threat. It was practical advice. He swallowed once and gave a small nod. "I never wanted to hurt him," he said. "I believe that," I replied. And I did. Weakness doesn't always come from cruelty. Sometimes it comes from selfishness disguised as confusion. I stepped back. "This conversation doesn't happen again," I said calmly. "You don't approach him about this, ever." "Understood." No handshake, no shouting, no public humiliation, just boundaries drawn without emotion. As I walked back toward my house, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, not satisfaction. Closure. Because confrontation without heat forces truth to stand on its own. No theatrics to hide behind. No anger to blame. Just two men facing the consequences of different choices. And for the first time in a decade, I wasn't carrying silence alone. The divorce was finalized. 8 months later, no courtroom drama, no public spectacle. Just signatures, structured agreements, and a recalibration of life. Emily moved to an apartment across town. Daniel listed his house 3 weeks after our driveway conversation. By the end of summer, he was gone. Caleb stayed with me, not because I demanded it, because routine had gravity. His school was nearby, his friends were here. His treehouse still stood in the backyard. And because when asked privately by a court-appointed mediator where he felt most steady, he said, with Dad. That word again. Steady, but it means something different to me now. Before, steady meant absorbing impact without visible reaction. Now, steady means acting without losing yourself. I eventually told Caleb a version of the truth. Not the betrayal, not the timeline, just this. Families are built in different ways. Biology isn't the only thing that makes someone a father. What matters is who shows up. He looked at me carefully. You're my dad, he said simply. There was no hesitation. Children don't measure love in chromosomes. They measure it in consistency. Emily and I maintain respectful communication. There's no bitterness in my voice when I speak to her. I don't rehearse grievances. I don't revisit arguments. What happened is recorded, understood, closed. I've learned something uncomfortable through all of this. Being underestimated can become a trap if you start believing the version of you that others find convenient. I allowed myself to become infrastructure, reliable, invisible, functional, and there's dignity in reliability. But there's danger in invisibility. Now I speak earlier when something feels off. Not aggressively, clearly. I don't confuse calm with passivity. I don't confuse trust with blindness. And I don't confuse love with self-erasure. Caleb and I still do Saturday pancakes. We still build small science experiments. We still sit some evenings, not needing conversation. The resemblance is still there. I see it sometimes in a certain light. It doesn't sting anymore, because fatherhood was never a biological contract for me. It was a choice made daily. What changed wasn't my love for him. What changed was my tolerance for deception. People sometimes ask how I stayed so calm. The answer is simple. Anger feels powerful in the moment. Clarity builds power long-term. I didn't win anything. I didn't defeat anyone. I simply refused to carry a narrative that wasn't true. And in doing that, I found something more durable than revenge. I found alignment. The man I am now isn't louder. He's not harder. He's not colder. He's just precise. There's a version of this story where I become the angry husband, where I flip tables, expose secrets publicly, make someone pay loudly for what they did quietly. That version would be easier to tell, but it wouldn't be honest. The truth is simpler and harder. The day I realized the son I'd devoted 10 years to raising bore the face of the neighbor my wife claimed to despise, something in me didn't explode. It clarified. I learned that love and truth are not opposites. You can love deeply and still refuse deception. You can stay calm and still move decisively. You can be quiet and still be unshakable. Biology didn't define my fatherhood, but honesty defined my future. If there's a lesson here, it's this. Silence is not weakness, unless it's rooted in fear. Silence becomes strength when it's rooted in awareness. And awareness demands action, not loud action, not vindictive action. Deliberate action. I didn't punish anyone. I adjusted. I didn't destroy my family. I restructured it. There's grief in that, yes, but there's also dignity, because the worst betrayal isn't infidelity. It's allowing yourself to ignore what you know. If you've ever sensed something small that didn't sit right, if you've ever been told you were overthinking, if you've ever been the steady one everyone relied on, the steady. Ask yourself this. Are you staying quiet because you're strong, or because you're afraid of what clarity might require? I'd genuinely like to know what you would have done in my position. Would you have confronted immediately? Would you have chosen denial for the sake of peace? Or would you have waited, like I did, until silence became strategy? Tell me in the comments, not to judge, but to understand.